Hi, folks. So the discussion that I'm going to have this evening is quite a serious one, but I think it's always worth investigating all areas and not having anything that you don't want to sort of look into. And the discussion really is on monsters and demons and on people's beliefs, but more generally on spiritual forces in the world. Um, my own position is, I think, when it comes to demons, monsters, that I don't actually have a belief in them or disbelief. I'm sort of agnostic, really, and I keep an open mind to potential for things that could be. Um, and there's several reasons why I have this position. I tend to think that people do good and bad, and I've seen evidence of that. I've witnessed and experienced it, and seen other people doing good and bad to others. And I've no evidence to say there are any demons or a devil or monsters in any sense. That's not to say there aren't, um, because there can be many things that we can't prove in life. I have a belief in God, and I don't have what one would consider scientific evidence to prove that, hence the need for faith. But the evidence that I have, I suppose, is in my own life experiences. But I remain agnostic about both angels and demons, if I'm honest. And I don't really know if there's evidence. I haven't seen any evidence to support any belief in such things. I do feel that sometimes that I can be possessed by an angry spirit. I can be tempted by reckless anger sometimes, where I feel emotionally really angry inside, and I've allowed that sometimes to get the better of me, where I sort of react to someone and behave in a really horrible manner, where I'll shout or speak abusively, use vulgar terms. Um, now, do I think that a demon has influenced or made me do that? Well, maybe that there's some spiritual force that influences me to do things. It's possible, but I think that on those occasions, really, I feel that it's probably other people and that have said things that have provoked me. But ultimately, it's myself that I have chosen to and consented to behaving badly in times of my life. Not just in terms of anger, but in greed as well. When I've taken things from others, or I've not shared things of my own that I could have done. And so it depends how you look at it, really. It is possible that there are these kind of bad, sinister forces that can influence us. I'm not going to rule that out. But at the same time, I don't think that we don't have some capacity to control our own behavior. I recognize that where I've behaved badly, whether that's selfishness, whether that's being fearful and cowardly, or whether that's being angry and unrestrained in that anger, in whatever capacity, I recognize that that's down to my own fault, to not rein in and control my emotions myself. And so I have to take responsibility for that. I can't say, I could never say about any of my actions in life, something else outside of me was to blame for what I did. Certainly there can be times under provocation where people wind you up, or they'll do things that are really upsetting and provoking. But how you react to those things is down to you. How I react is down to me, and we can react well to things even when it's severe provocation. And there's good and bad ways of reacting to bad things that are done to us. Now, I'm wary of beliefs in demons and monsters, I suppose, just because I feel that it could be a way of trying to absolve ourselves of responsibility, to blame something outside of ourselves for doing something. That's not to say that those things don't exist. They possibly may do. the fact that there's large numbers of people that believe in it doesn't make it true, but it makes me want to investigate and keep an open mind to it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to sort of go and believe something because millions of people do believe that. That's the popular. How popular something isn't necessarily a good indicator of whether it's true or not. You have to sort of look for what is evidence. Is it credible evidence as well? And it's interesting that there's a wide variety of different people that do believe in demons, in actual fact. So I think it's worthwhile everyone sort of investigating it cautiously. Muslims believe, I think, in jinn, as they call it, in kind of spiritual forces. I don't know if they're sort of like spirits or ghosts in this other realm where they're said to influence people. But I think they also believe in angels, perhaps. But ultimately, Muslims, I think, believe in God as the source of their prayer and devotion. But it's not just limited to Muslims. Christians believe in demons, I suppose, or the devil, and they both have that in common with Satanists, I suppose, who believe in demons. But if there are people that are Satanists, you read about that they, I suppose, believe in demons as having a good positive influence on their lives. There are those you hear about that worship demons, Satanists, for example. So I've come and I probably have met a few, but more online. I've heard lots of research about them, and I'm quite sure that there are probably many that do believe in demons, and that they believe in them as having an importance in their lifestyle. So whilst I'm agnostic about it, I don't have any fixed belief on it. I'm open-minded. My own beliefs, though, are that God is actually the creator of all things. So I believe in God as the ultimate creator, and that God, in fact, as I understand God, is benevolent. That is to say, that God creates things for good reason, for a purpose. We don't always know what that purpose is, though. So as I would view it, under my theology, my understanding is that God creates all things, all spirits. We're all created by God. That's not to say that we all do good. We don't, of course. My belief is that God has created the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of good and evil, which is what is created after the Garden of Eden. So how I view things is that the Garden of Eden is an era, is a time, like the childhood of mankind, where we were innocent and we were in a close relationship with God at that point. Very much like a parent is to a very young child, where we're totally dependent upon that parent at that time. But as you get older, you tend to have more knowledge, and with that comes more responsibility, because, and there's a moral dimension to that as we're learning and growing over the years. We tend to accumulate more knowledge, but with that comes the potential to do more good, but also more bad, of course. So that's very much the upbringing of a child is how I view the history of mankind in general, in actual fact. I see the Garden of Eden as the innocence of early childhood, and then the knowledge of good and evil, described as a tree because a tree grows and matures. And so over the years, indeed over hundreds and thousands of years, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as I believe it, has grown and continues to branch out. And so our capacity to do both good and bad has grown over many centuries and millenniums. But I would personally put that down to our own choices that we personally make. And we're given many moral dilemmas within our lifetimes. And this I view as part of a karmic cycle. And the reason for that is as a test. And it's through those tests that our character is proven. It's those tests of endurance, a test of patience, that it tests our ability to care for each other. And it's through that kind of testing process and through various different kinds of tests that we have the chance to learn and grow. If you look back in your life, actually, probably the good times when you were happy, when you were going out partying, on holiday, having fun with your mates, actually, although they were good and, probably a great source of enjoyment, sharing time with loved ones, you probably don't grow that much spiritually during those times, actually. It's actually the times of hardship and struggle. That's probably when you grow more as a person, although you don't willingly want those things. I know that when I went through a time of homelessness for a month or two, I had to sort of try and seek things of help and support that I wouldn't normally do. I was forced to go and speak to strangers, to try and be creative in finding somewhere to sleep for a night. It put me in situations and challenged me in a way that staying at home with home comforts didn't. And various other struggles can really force you to sort of confront things within yourself and, learning new abilities you really never thought you would do. And I actually think, it's through those challenges that we actually are forced to struggle more and seek a sort of an inner strength within ourselves, like an illness, for another example. That can be a source of great suffering and hardship, whether it's physical or mental. But at the same time, it challenges us to dig deep, to find an inner strength within us, to carry on, to persevere, and endure a strength of endurance, So it's through those hardships, isn't it, that we are able to prove ourselves, in a sense. I want to turn now to one of my favourite old theology books, the Book of Job, actually. It's one of the few books that I actually think I can really connect with, and I don't have serious issues theologically with, as I do with many other books, to be honest with you. And in this book, it's quite relevant to this discussion, because actually the devil's portrayed in this book as testing us. Just to give you a sort of short summary of it. So there's a character within it called Job, I think it's pronounced. So anyway, in the court of heaven, devil goes up to God and says, who among humans are really worthy of your love and attention? These humans, they don't really listen to you. They're just selfish. They just want to look after themselves. They really don't care about you or your planet or their fellow man that much. And God says, well, Job is a loyal servant who strives to do what's right and what's righteous. But the devil counters that by saying, yes, but he's actually had quite an easy life. His life is full of blessings. He's fairly wealthy. He has a good, supportive family behind him. He has his loyal, devoted children, lots of friends. He has lots of land, a nice house. He's in good health. Well, of course, he is thankful to you. Of course, he gives praise to you and strives to do good. It's easy for him to do good because his life is going well at that point. And that's true in our lives. When things are going well, it's easier, isn't it? It's much more easier to get along and be nice to other people and to smile and laugh. The devil at this point in the court of heaven, in the book of Job, says the only reason Job is being a loyal servant is because he's got an easy life at the moment. But if you put him through hardships and trials, you'll soon see that he will turn his back on you and he won't be so faithful and he won't be devout. He won't be thankful to you. He'll soon curse you and turn his back on you. Just put him through the trials and you'll see. So the devil, in that sense, is playing the agent provocateur. And he's saying, like the prosecution would in a court of law, the suspect, he's not really there being a devoted son to you or a servant to you. He's only doing that because of the good conditions that he's in. So God says, okay, I will submit Job to undergo various trials to prove his character, to see whether he is a loyal servant, even under hardships. And so Job does undergo various trials. His friends turn their back on him. He loses his wealth and goes into poverty. He loses many of his cattle, which was a great sign of wealth in those times. Family abandon him, and he becomes very ill physically with these awful conditions that causes him lots of aches and pains. And in that state, isolated in poor physical health, abandoned by friends and family, he does have his struggles, and he questions God, in fact. And in fact, what happens is some of the friends visiting him, they even accuse Job of being unfaithful, of bringing his illnesses on himself. Quite an awful thing to be accused of bringing an illness on yourself. That itself was a kind of trial. But Job does question God. Actually, he doesn't completely curse God. He doesn't go that far, but he does say awful things in his situation through his suffering. He does rant and become mad at some point and goes on this whole long ramble. Whether it's a true story or allegorical, I'm not sure, but I do think it's got some interesting theological points. And Job goes on this whole rant where he's questioning God, and saying, why on earth would you submit me to all this suffering? What have I done to deserve any of this? And that's really interesting because it's the kind of thing that many people ask. It confronts that kind of question that actually is a question that many people of faith are going through or have gone through. How can God, if God is so loving and benevolent, how can God allow such suffering? How can God allow such poverty, allow such physical illness, allow people to be alienated and separated and to be accused of awful things? And these are questions that many people of faith do struggle with. So what's presented there is not some sort of weird, obscure, rare thing, but actually a very common thing that all people of faith will struggle and endure and go through. And so Job's struggles are very similar to other people's struggles. And that's why I believe it's a very interesting book and one I would refer people to when they feel like they're in times of struggles. And really, Job does question God. And I think it's fair to a point to question things, as long as we are fair in our questioning of all things. I don't think we should treat God or as any different, really. I think everything is fair to question, so long as our questioning is fair. But really, the response within the book of Job from God is, where were you at the beginning of the world, when all things were created, when the stars themselves were created, when the sun and the moon were put in their orbits, when the souls of things were created, when the purposes of life were created? In other words, how do you know the essence and the meaning of life to question all things? Now, all very well questioning things, but coming up with answers is the mistake that Job did. Assuming that that he was undergoing something that was wrong and that was unfair for him. Well, he couldn't see at that point why it was happening. He didn't see that it was a trial, a test of faith. And it would be hard to know, because in the context of that book, he's not given any reason for why anything happened at the time. It might have appeared to him quite meaningless and quite arbitrary and quite wrong. He might have viewed it as him being punished almost for having tried to do what was right, not in everything, but in general in his life. So I think, it's worthwhile considering that. Do we really know enough to come to firm answers and verdicts about the actual reason of why we're here, of what the ultimate purpose is in life? And I think, we should be cautious about accepting, what answers are to all things in life, because aren't we here to find what those answers are? I think it's interesting to sort of research and find out what different people's beliefs are in life. And I do wonder, I keep an open mind about whether there are such things as demons. It's quite possible. I mean, in that context of the book of Job, the demon is presented as someone who is accusing of mankind, who really wants to actually put mankind down because he sees the worst in people, and is almost acting as the Crown Prosecution Service for, in the court of law, really, as a prosecutor, sort of seeing the worst in people and sort of saying, well, if we put people through a test of some sort, could that prove whether they are a good character or not? Wouldn't that sort of endurance test the nature of their character? Now, there are various ideas of demons that actually have that capacity. If a demon is there to tempt people, you could say to lure people into bad, maybe there is a purpose to that, to tempt us, to try us as a test, So in actual fact, it could be, if there are such things, that there's a purpose to that, that it is there in order to sort of lead us astray, to see whether we give in and yield to such temptations or not, to see what the strength of our resolve, what our character is, to see if we are able to overcome such temptations in such trials or not. So there could be a purpose, therefore, if such things exist, of why God would create and allow those things. But it's worthwhile remembering in the book of Job that even the devil, has certain powers, but they're under God. God allows and consents to Job's suffering up to a point, but sees it and justifies it as having a purpose, albeit Job within that context doesn't know himself what that purpose is. So it is quite possible, if I look at it from a theological point of view, that there could be demonic forces that are allowed to some extent some power or influence over our lives if we submit and allow ourselves to have that. But I don't think that personally any sort of demons and that can have any power over us unless we consent and allow it to have that. I look at that as personally from my own personal experience, but I think like times when I've given in to something, when I've been sort of selfish and I've given in to sort of I don't want to go out and make an effort to go out and support other people. I wanted to be lazy and just stay in, perhaps. Is that because there's something sort of influencing me, some spiritual force? You might interpret it that, or it might just be that that's my own desire and that's my own choice. In the same manner that if I give in to an angry kind of temperament and that's unrestrained and I take that out and verbally assault other people, is that because an angry spirit perhaps has influenced me to do that and I've allowed it to have influence over me? Or is that just because I have an angry temperament myself and I don't rein in my temperaments and I don't control my emotions enough? So it depends how you look at it. Some people have that theory that on the day of judgment, that even the devil will be called to give witness against other people, to say that he had no power or influence over others, only that which they allowed him to have over them. I don't know about that because I remain agnostic about such things, So, but that is certainly a theory that many people have out there. Now, just to look at various groups, what their different theories are, because it's interesting to look at varying different perspectives of demons. Well, if you look at different Satanists, allegedly they are meant to be differentiated from Luciferians. There's some sort of difference between them. I'm not sure if they overlap in their beliefs, perhaps. And I've only got limited research from them, and how much of the research can you trust? I don't know because I've never been to such events. I don't partake in such things. But from what I have gleaned from research, it would seem that Satanists have some sort of belief in a demonic presence. Now, whether they worship a demon or not, it would seem that perhaps some do. Luciferians, I suppose, believe that Lucifer, in actual fact, rather than being a fallen angel, as is told in some books of what's called the Bible, rather than being this fallen angel, he's actually, they would interpret it, I guess, as he's actually got this sacred knowledge. They don't see him as a rebel from heaven that was outcast. Rather, I guess they see God potentially as a dictator trying to prevent Lucifer from having this secret knowledge that actually has got some great use. Well, I suppose it depends on what that kind of knowledge is. I look at the knowledge of good and evil. And I see that knowledge of good and evil is there, personally, my own view, as a way to test us, and as a way that we would learn by it. We learn responsibility. We have the ability, all of us, to do good and to do evil. And so that's how we learn. A child or an adolescent learns by giving them more responsibility in life, But that means the more good they can do, the more bad they can do. But I think that depends on knowing what is good and bad, of course, and discerning that. There does seem to be. It's very difficult for me to know what actual people's beliefs are, how trustworthy are, what people say and what their beliefs really are. We don't really know, especially if they're in a secret society of some sort. And I sort of question, why would you want to be in a secret society? There can be good or bad reasons for that. You might be fearful that other people might misuse the information that you've got and use it in a wrongful way. Or they might, they might find out information about you and think wrong things about you and jump to the wrong conclusions, potentially. Or you might be hiding some really bad things from the world that you don't want them to know about. So the fact that someone's in a secret society, there could be good and bad about that, and I don't want to sort of jump to conclusions about that. Well, there's no secret about, the Church of Satanism, set up in 1966. I think Anton LaVey, who set that up, that's become more of a sort of, it's a very small marginal group that follow that, but I think it's a very sort of small cult-like following. Whether they are serious in their beliefs or not, whether it's done for show and to scare people, or whether they really do indulge in various things, who knows the extent of what goes on within their groups and what that involves. Whether they do worship the Baphomet or an image of the devil, or I just it's quite possible that some people do. So I think it's worth investigating for that, and maybe they want to influence other people to do that if that's what they believe in, potentially. And I would caution people against doing anything like that personally. I've never felt the urge to do anything like that in my life. I was an atheist for many years. I neither believed in demons, angels, nor God for many years. I thought all of it was quite irrational. I still think that angels and demons are quite irrational, but then I'm quite aware that many others would think my belief in God is probably irrational too. So the fact that something might appear irrational, doesn't make it invalid for me. But I neither have seen the evidence to prove that. But I do think it's interesting that there are those that kind of want to push this idea of the devil as potentially having this great power over mankind and great influence. There are many Christians that believe that too. In fact, they say sometimes that the devil is the god of this world. In fact, but I don't believe that. And there are some Satanists, at least I think from my research, that do believe that as well. Though I'm not quite sure, because research tends to be quite mixed, and I'm not sure what's reliable sometimes. But I think personally, if there are demons and that they only really have any influence over you that you allow and give them consent to. If you don't, then they don't have that influence over you. In fact, and I would say that that's true of anything that influences you, really. Like when you are at a seminar and a professor's giving you a lecture, for example, well, you might well sit and listen and take on board what they're saying. You might be engaged with considering it. But if you are passively listening to it without being critical at all, if you blindly follow that person, then yes, that is going to have an influence over you. But if you are sort of debating the issue, you're actively engaged, you're questioning the points that professor said, you're making notes and saying, oh, I don't agree on that point, or I'm going to question that, and then perhaps you're not being influenced by it so much as, depends how you're being influenced, I suppose. But that's true of other things, isn't it? So I suppose it depends what relationship you have to that thing that's influencing you. If you give yourself fully to something and submit to it fully, blindly, then that's a different thing, isn't it, than listening to something, thinking about it, and then responding and questioning it. That's quite a different kind of thing, isn't it? There's a big difference between passively following and accepting something and actively critiquing, deconstructing, and examining something. So I think it depends how we relate to different things, whether it influences us and how it influences us. But that's true of other people, isn't it? As well as potentially other spiritual forces, if they exist or not. I think it's interesting to look at how different groups do relate to things like demons or monsters or even God. There's different kind of ideas about God that are competing with each other too. And there will be about monsters too. So I think, there are different groups that have different ideologies about monsters or demons. There are obviously the atheists who say there are no such thing. We don't believe in them. They don't believe in demons or angels or God or any gods for that matter. Then there are agnostics, those people that are agnostic about God and demons and angels too, for I suppose, and other supernatural phenomenon perhaps as well. And then you have the agnostic theists rather than Gnostic theists, who maybe accept that there are such things, but they debate the nature of those things. And I would put myself more in that category, I think, really. That even though I do think there probably are positive and negative spiritual forces, I still feel that as a student of life, I'm learning what those are. I don't have all of the knowledge to know absolutely everything about them. And I doubt, actually, to be honest with you, whether anyone does. And I'm quite suspicious of those people that present beliefs that are sort of completely all-knowing. I'm always a bit wary of those kind of totality-based beliefs, to be honest. I'm very wary of beliefs about monsters or demons that present them as being totally all-knowing and all-powerful somehow. I think there's, I think maybe some people have those ideas, and I don't doubt some people believe those things, but belief in something, in no way makes it true at all. In the same way, disbelief doesn't make something true either. So there are various different kind of ideologies about both demonic, angelic, and godly phenomenons. We shouldn't assume that there's just one kind of core belief about things. We've got to look at different variations and different competitive ideologies that make different claims and weigh up those different claims to assess, does that actually accord with my own life experiences within my life? Does that seem like something that I can agree with? It's not something that is abstract and, imaginary. It's something that you have to assess in the real world, isn't it? In the life that you've been living over the weeks, months, and years. So I've come to some sort of tentative findings, but I think there's still a lot more to learn on it. And I think even for people that are atheists, it's really important to research what many other people in the world believe, because I think that's, you could be influenced by those things yourself, whether consciously or unconsciously, perhaps. And indeed, friends and family and other people could be too. So it's worthwhile knowing what hundreds of thousands or millions of other people in the world believe, because, of course, many of those people will be producing various films, songs, or other media work, that could influence us unconsciously. And if we're not aware of those things, it's much more likely to unconsciously affect us and influence us too. And of course, it could affect and influence other people that we know, of course, So it's really worthwhile sort of looking at those sort of different ideologies. If you look at Hinduism, it's actually one of the most ancient world religions, and they've got a huge variation of various ideas and ideologies, both about monsters and angels and God and gods. And that's really fascinating. You look at something like the Brahmins, they believed in the absolute reality. It's a sort of a kind of notion of God. And I think that they probably originally did have a monotheistic idea of God. But I think over the many millenniums, they branched out to have many different pantheons of different ideas about God. Many destructive gods, like Kali, the god of death, for example. But in actual fact, I would look at God as being the creator of life and death. I don't look at death necessarily as a bad thing from my own point of view. I look at life and death as a natural phenomenon that God creates. And I just think that personally, from my point of view, in my theology, if there are such things as demons or angels, even that God has created such things for a reason, and I would say the reason is to tempt us, or as a kind of trial, I suppose. And I've never felt inclined to worship any such things, but at the same time, I have idolized things too. And I think that, sometimes, I've put alcohol or drugs sometimes as too central a thing within my life, or even an idea that I've become obsessed with sometimes, or even a person I could be infatuated with, or a job, or a wealth of many other different things. Some people idolize money, don't they? Or power, or fame, or another person. Or like I said, alcohol or drugs, or possessions. There could be any number of things that we idolize. That have got that kind of profound influence upon our lives, where it has such an effect that it's really leading us and it's controlling what we are doing in all these different aspects of our lives. Now, for people that have a strong faith in God, God is actually the center of our lives, and it is the one thing in the center that we are able to be led by, rather than any other possessions, be they material or spiritual. So I think when I was sort of atheistic, I more was sort of led to have materialistic possessions that influenced me and that I created different idols of at different points in my life. But I think as I've had struggles with faith, those things are still a recurring sort of temptation and trial for me. And I don't think I'm sort of fully overcome in those things where they're not still a risk factor. And in fact, they probably still are. And I imagine that's true for others too, as well. So So those are my sort of general thoughts. But I think there's still a lot more to sort of say on those things, really.